Right. We do quite a number of exposés on this show, and this is a fairly long and deep expose. And it was first covered by SOTT.net. And it tells the story to Americans of why this country is in a complete mess, and yet barely anyone covers it in any depth. Israel gets most of its lifeblood from the US through foreign aid or stealing. And a prime example of this was the Apollo affair, where Israel stole enriched uranium from the US to build their infamous nuclear weapons program through a suspected Mossad agent, Zalman Shapiro, along with 4 Israeli intelligence agents, including Rafi Eitan, who visited MUMEC periodically between 1965 and 1970. And this is how Israel has operated, and this will lay it out very comprehensively of how far it goes. And the alt media barely covers it, as the person from SOTT, I forget her name now, and it barely goes further than the Apollo affair. They don't report on the much deeper and more consequential Israeli thieving of US high technology through its Talpiot program and also Unit 8200, which we covered fairly extensively last year. And billions of dollars are being sucked out of the US economy through government contracts to Israeli technology and cyber security companies like Amdocs, which has access to all US telephone records through the NSA, and Converse Infosys, which has access to all NSA electronic tapping equipment. Essentially, Israel runs the national security state. Israel companies can spy on you. And where did they get the capability to become world leaders in the technology sector? The United States. And part of the reason why Israeli tech firms are so competitive in the global market is due to a form of quasi-state capitalism in which the Israeli government subsidizes 50% of Israeli tech firms of their R&D costs. And this gives these firms the ability to sell their goods and services at significantly lower prices than their American counterparts. Now, we have covered that previously in our shows. And what that is the non-compete plan that was laid out in 1976, where specified companies get materials at 50% of cost. Israel runs the national security state, the article said. That explains the National Security Act now, doesn't it? An act to commit crimes and get away with it. In essence, the National Security Act makes every day for them a Day of Atonement Day. And the report goes on and said this policy is socialist in nature, which Phil Giraldi pointed out in a speech for the Council for the National Interest, that stated Israel, a socialist country where government and business work hand in hand, has obtained significant advantages by systematically stealing American technology with both civilian and military applications. And subsequently, Israel uses this advantage to flood the US market with their technology exports, partly due to the 1985 Israel-United States Free Trade Agreement, which destroyed American high technology jobs in the process. And this was the first free trade agreement agreed upon by the United States. And it reduces all tariffs on Israeli imports and is the only free trade agreement that does not have a chapter on intellectual property rights. Those who signed it should pay. And that means that Israel can have access to US intellectual property under US law. US Judaic law being the correct term. So how did Israel get access to US high technology and also intellectual property? Well, it all began in the 1970s when the US and Israeli governments formed BIRD, B-I-R-D, Israel United States Binational Industrial Research and Development Foundation. Now, BIRD funds joint partnerships between Israeli and American companies, with 50% of its funding coming from the US government. That's right. Our taxpayer money is funding Israeli industry, while our infrastructure is in shambles. And this is a quote from a Bloomberg article, is Talpiot in action. The company BIRD promotes joint industrial R&D between Israel and American companies. They provide a maximum of $1.2 million funding per project. BIRD-supported projects allows leading Israel technology companies to access key world-class US companies and establish business ties. US government-funded BIRD gives Israel tech companies access to world-class US companies. And that is where the Israeli high-tech industry gets its lifeblood from. So using this access to US industry, Israel set up a massive espionage operation in the United States to steal US defense secrets, military technology, and intellectual property in the early 1980s. And one operative, Jonathan Pollard, was caught in this operation. Pollard was a US intelligence agent stroke Israeli spy who stole thousands of documents revealing the methods used by the US for signal intelligence gathering. From then on, Israel had the same intelligence gathering capabilities as the United States. But without Pollard, Israel would never have been able to engage in signal intelligence gathering, which means that the infamous Israeli companies tied to 9/11, Amdocs and Verint, would never have been formed. But Pollard was just the tip of the iceberg. There was a whole Israeli espionage network surrounding and working with Pollard, including guys like Richard Perle, Frank Gaffney Jr., Douglas J. Feith, John F. Lehman Jr. and Paul Wolfowitz. All this technology that Israel has stolen was developed by taxpayer money through DARPA. Nearly all of Apple's technology was developed by DARPA. Go-Ogle emerged through DARPA technology, and the CIA's MDDS, Massive Digital Data Systems project, and Facebook raised its initial capital through an investment from Peter Thiel, whose data mining company Palantir was first funded by the CIA venture capital firm called In-Q-Tel. Furthermore, there are Zionist fingerprints all over tech giants like Go-Ogle and Facebook. Go Ogle was initially partially funded by the American Jewish person Andy Bechtolsheim, the co-founder of the tech firm Sun Microsystems, which has a major R&D center, research and development in Israel. Many other tech firms, including Go Ogle, Facebook, IBM, Motorola, Microsoft, Qualcomm, and Apple all have research and development centers in Israel as well. Why would these firms choose to have R&D centers near Tel Aviv, when Tel Aviv is the ninth most expensive city in the world? Furthermore, it would make more sense economically to have R&D centers in a place like, say, Bangladesh, where wages are significantly lower with a similar supply of high-tech workers. But these companies operate in Israel because they seek to make Israel the high-tech capital of the world, where Israel will rule the world in a one-world government from Jerusalem, just as Ben-Gurion had predicted. Furthermore, Israel sells their US-originated high technology to our so-called enemies, Russia and China. Russia and China then sell that technology to Iran. Therefore, Israel is indirectly, or actually directly, arming Iran. You know, them boogie people. The Iran-Israel conflict is a charade. If Israel was really an enemy of Iran, they would never allow China to sell Israeli-sold military technology to Iran, let alone sell Israeli military technology to China in the first place. But unbeknown to the article writer, Israel sold nuclear weapons directly to Iran in the last 2 decades of the last century. Oops. On top of that, Israel has numerous historical ties to the Islamic Republic of Iran. And the article writer ran an article, Iran not an enemy of the Jewish elite, which is correct. AriWatch.com does a fantastic job of detailing the history of Israel transferring US technology to China in their article, Israel's Technology Transfer to China. On June the 13th, 1990, the Los Angeles Times reported that Israel had become the largest supplier of advanced military technology to China since the United States banned military sales to that country a year earlier. You see what's going on here? The US government bans Americans from selling it, so the Israelis can sell it. That's what that's just told you. An unnamed US official told the newspaper that Israel was a backdoor to US technology that the United States won't sell them. Israel was breaching the US embargo against China using technology the US had given to Israel for its own defense, even though the technology came with the restriction that Israel would not re-export it. And shortly before the Times report, Israel opened an office of the Israeli Academy of Sciences in Beijing. Now, doubtless, it was that blatant act that caused US officials to begin leaking information at the time, and the Times source said that Israel's supposedly academic office in Beijing was actually facilitating a whole range of military-to-military cooperation between Israel and China. And according to the article, intelligence experts in the West and Asia believed Israel had provided China with some of the advanced technology needed to modernize China's jet planes and also missiles. US officials had told Israel they strongly opposed the military cooperation because it undercut US sanctions against China. And this is over our objections, a senior administration official told the newspaper. And the US official said that Israel was not operating as a proxy for the United States in these sales. Yeah, right. Now, the story had no discernible impact on Israel. Yes, they just shut it down like they always did. And it carried on selling arms technology to China and upgrading relations between the two countries. And a year after the Times report in June 1991, China and Israel signed an agreement on scientific cooperation. November the 20th, 1991, the East Coast Press reported that the Israeli Defense Minister Moshe Ahrens made a secret 4-day visit to China earlier that month. By the end of 1991, China's Deputy Foreign Minister Yang Fuchang then visited Israel, planning for the New World Order, public version. On January 24, 1992, China and Israel established formal diplomatic relations in ceremonies in Beijing, and the occasion was attended by the Chinese Foreign Minister Qian Keishan and the Israeli Foreign Minister David Levy. Levies. Tax. The Sino-Israeli relationship was a strange one, as China traditionally favoured the Arabs in the Arab-Israeli conflict. Moreover, while Israel based its pleas for enormous amounts of US aid on the danger from Arab countries, its selling of weapons technology to China was indirectly helping strengthen the Arabs, because China was a major supplier of missiles to Iran and such other Arab countries as Saudi Arabia and Syria. Are you seeing the pattern now? And in an obvious attempt to dampen the burgeoning Sino-Israeli relationship, US officials stepped up their leaks. Unnamed officials revealed in early March 1992 that there was an overwhelming evidence of Israel cheating on written promises not to re-export US weapons technology to third world countries, including China. And they added that there was a well-founded suspicion that Israel was also selling secrets of America's Patriot anti-missile missile to China. And a US team of experts was dispatched to Israel in late March of that year, but it failed to find proof of Israeli cheating. That's because it was likely made up of AIPAC-approved experts is why. Well, the State Department said on April the 2nd, 1992, that the Israeli government has a clean bill of health on the Patriot missile issue, but there was disagreement in the government. Darth Vader himself, Defense Secretary Dick Cheney, said there remained good reason to believe diversion had taken place. CIA Director Robert Gates agreed, saying there is some indication that they, the Chinese, have some of the Patriot technology. Now, about the same time, a study by the Pentagon supported Rand Corporation. Hello, Jared Rand. Clown. Became public with the conclusion that Israel had become China's leading foreign supplier of advanced technology. So essentially they were getting a load of cheap technology, some of it stolen, some of it aided because of the nasty Arabs that are always attacking them. And then Israel made massive profits by then reselling that technology and weaponry to China. And it said there had been reports that Israel had helped China develop the HQ-661 surface-to-air missile, the CSS-2 intermediate missile, the PL-8 air-to-air and surface-to-air missile, as well as an advanced armour for battle tanks and an airborne early warning radar system. And it was also said that Israel was currently cooperating with China to develop an advanced fighter jet. And these disclosures were followed by a report in the Wall Street Journal saying that Israel illegally re-exports technology to a number of countries beyond China, including Chile, Ethiopia, South Africa, and also Thailand. And there was no doubt in the US intelligence community that Israel had repeatedly engaged in diversion schemes. And yet, what did they do about it? Nothing. The Washington Post added that one official said there was lots and lots of clear-cut cases, and apparently the US had more than enough evidence to convict Israel if it had the political will to do so. Except they're all in the back pockets of AIPAC. The leaks by unnamed official sources came just days before the Israeli Defense Minister Moshe Aarons was due to meet on March 16, 1992, with his counterpart Dick Cheney. Aarons' initial public reaction was outrage. There is not a grain of truth, no truth in it at all, but the volume of the charges grew, and his statements changed to questioning the motives of the leakers. A common slide from the narrative. These Hebrew Anunnaki are so clever at. The real story is, who are these unnamed individuals who are floating these malicious rumours? Defence Secretary Cheney and his spokesman declined any comment. Yeah, because he's part problem as well. On April 1st, 1992, the State Department released a report by its Inspector General charging that a major recipient of US military aid was engaged in a systematic and growing pattern of selling secret US technology in violation of US law. The public report did not directly name Israel, but officials left no doubt that it was the subject of the report. The report said Israel's violations began about 1983 and that Israel sought to conceal the violations. A secret version of the report allegedly identified Chile, China, Ethiopia, and South Africa as among recipients of Israel's sales. The State Department Inspector General Sherman M. Funk said he notified Secretary of State James A. Baker III about intelligence reports of Israel's violations in June 1991 and that new procedures to prevent future violations were put in place under an operation called Blue Lantern. Blue Lantern. Why is that a Because all things related to the Blue program is related to ETs. Perhaps that is another confirm for THI. Funk said US officials previously had depended on verbal assurances from Israel that it was not retransferring. But he said such assurances from Israel are not an effective mechanism for providing end-use verification. No shit, Sherlock. Israel is an anagram of raw lies. The same. And they constantly lie. It's what they do. We identified instances where US items and technology were retransferred or were used in violation of the assurances. And he added that he had recommended that Israel be forced to repay the money illicitly earned from the transfers, but Deputy Secretary of State Lawrence S. Eagleberger, who is born too, rejected the proposal as being an impossible chore. Eagleberger was a protege of the former Secretary of State, also born too, Henry Kissinger, and a strong supporter of Israel. Now, the subject went to the heart of the economic prosperity of the Jewish state, and arms sales of around $1.5 billion annually accounted for 40% of Israel's exports, and were based almost entirely on US technology. And how Israel became so technologically advanced was revealed in a study by the General Accounting Office. The giveaway began in 1970 with the signing of a Master Defense Development Data Exchange Agreement that provided for the greatest transfer of US technology to any country ever undertaken. The transfer was made by what was called technical data packages. Oh my. The entire complex of blueprints, plans, and types of materials required to actually construct weapons. Over the next 8 years, more than 120 such packages were given to Israel, according to the 1979 study by the Middle East Arms Transfer Panel. And this massive infusion of technology boosted Israel's economy, and by 1981, Israel had emerged from being a technologically backward arms importer to the 7th largest exporter of military weapons in the world, with an overseas sales of 1.3 billion. An Israeli writer observed the Americans have made virtually all their most advanced weaponry and technology, meaning the best fighter aircraft, missiles, radar, armour and artillery available to Israel. Israel in turn has utilised its knowledge, adapting American equipment to increase its own technological sophistication, reflected tangibly in Israeli defence offerings. Now, despite the number of reports over the years that Israel was illicitly profiting from US technology at the cost of American companies and also US security, Washington continued to provide Israel ever-increasing amounts of technology. And according to the report in 1992, there were 322 skull and bones separate cooperative US-Israeli ventures at the time, valued at $2.9 billion. In addition, there were 49 country-to-country programs involving Israel in co-development or co-production and research within the United States, and there existed 36 active data exchange agreements and 11 new proposed accords. And the report concluded that the magnitude of existing cooperative efforts with Israel is extensive and growing rapidly. In 1993, when Bill Clinton became president, he promised to lift the technological barrier by granting Israel even more sophisticated technology. Meanwhile, Sino-Israeli relations flourished. Israel President Chaim Herzog visited China between December the 24th and 30th, 1992. In 1993, with the administration of President Clinton taking over in Washington, Israel and China signed a contract permitting Israel to buy Chinese coal. Not American coal, no, Chinese. On February the 14th, 1993, the two countries signed a scientific agreement for joint research projects in electronics. Listen closely to the next one. Medical technology, renewable energy, agriculture, and civilian uses of space technology. In October of 1993, the CIA revealed to the Senate Governmental Affairs Committee that Israel had been selling advanced military technologies to China for more than a decade. The Central Intelligence Director R. James Woolsey estimated that the trade may be several $billions and added, building on a long history of close defense-industrial relations, including work on China's next-generation fighter, air-to-air missiles and tank programs, and the establishment of diplomatic relations in January 1992, China and Israel appear to be moving towards formalizing and broadening their military technical cooperation. Israel Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin denied that the trade reached billions of dollars, adding that the figure for 1992 was about $60 million, and said all these stories of billions of dollars of arms business in the past 10 years are total nonsense, he said. We have made it clear time and time again that we have never done a thing against American law. Perhaps you never defined what is American law. And never transmitted items of technology that we got from the United States. Yet again, they lie. And then he said this. 1992, remember? We are not stupid enough to endanger Israel's annual $3 billion in US aid. 30 years ago, they were getting $3 billion of the American people's money, plus all this technology that they made more billions of dollars, plus loans that they never repay back. And he issued his statement in Beijing, where he was on an official 4-day visit. Like I said, he lied. It's what they do. The CIA said that indications of a stronger Sino-Israeli ties were the opening of a number of Israeli military sales offices in China, and on February the 14th, 1993, the signing of an agreement to share technology, and then the current visit to Beijing of Rabin. And the report stated, we believe that the Chinese seek from Israel advanced military technologies that the US and Western firms are unwilling to provide them. And Beijing probably hopes to tap Israel's expertise for cooperative development of military technologies such as advanced tank power plants and airborne radar systems that the Chinese would have had difficulty producing on their own. In 1994, Professor Duncan L. Clark of the American University in Washington, D.C. reported in a study for years Israel had violated the Arms Export Control Act and related executive agreements. And no one did anything to stop it. Israel has employed US weaponry contrary to US law and policy, incorporated US technology into Israel weapon systems without prior approval, and made improper transfers of US missiles and other defense systems and technologies to other countries including China, Chile, and South Africa. In 1995 came another series of media reports on Israel's China trade, and these led to official denials by Israel. Yeah, denials is correct, that's where they come from. Denial. Egypt. David Ivry, the Director General of the Israeli Defense Ministry, admitted on January the 3rd that Israel had sold China some technology on aircraft, but added that it was not US technology and that the contracts were very small in magnitude. Yet again, they lie. On January 6th, Adid Ben Ami, the spokesperson for the Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, again denied that Israel had illegally transferred any US technology to China. 2 days later, the Defense Secretary William Perry discussed the issue with the Prime Minister Rabin in Jerusalem, but the Israeli leader again denied that any US technology was involved. Then suddenly the issue disappeared from the public eye. Oh my. I wonder what leverage they used. The controversy that had begun in 1990 with anonymous leaks had grown into official charges by the United States, culminated at the beginning of 1995 with discussions between the two countries at the highest level. After Perry's meeting with Rabin, the subject dropped from public sight. What action was taken, if any, was not announced. They just carried on, is what happened. And this is a key quote from the article. Moreover, while Israel based its plea for enormous amounts of US aid on the danger from Arab countries, its selling of weapons technology to China was indirectly helping strengthen the Arabs because China was the major supplier of missiles to Iran and other Arab countries like Saudi Arabia and Syria. You see, it's all a scam. They're all in this together. Israel transfers high technology to China, who in turn transfers that technology to Arab countries and Iran. Therefore, Israel is an indirect ally of Iran and Syria. And I bet you thought that Assad of Syria was an arch enemy of Israel. Well, Syria gets extensive military technology from Russia and China, provided by Israel. And according to the Brookings Institution, Russia and China provide cover for Assad's Syria. Therefore, Israel indirectly provides cover for Assad's Syria. Now, recently, Israel's tolerance of Assad has become clear, and according to this article by Haaretz, several weeks ago, Israel reportedly told Russia that it wouldn't oppose that Assad in power, as if the decision were in its hands or as if Israel even had any leverage over what kind of government is in power in Syria after the war ends. It's all an illusion. It's a bit like the Cold War, An absolute fake illusion. In conclusion, Israel's military and high technology sectors are US taxpayer subsidized. 100% of it. Our taxpayer money is going to a country which sells our high technology to our so-called enemies, namely China and also Iran. Except neither are enemies per se. They're boogeymen created by the same country that sold them the weapons and technology, Israel. China uses the technology from Israel to then steal US intellectual property, which the Trump administration has rightly brought up as an issue. However, the Trump administration, according to the article writer, this is not me on this part, never mentions Israel, who directly hands China this technology. President Trump does not care at all about US intellectual property theft. If he did, he would call Israel out. And he said he won't, though, because Trump and his buddy Putin are, quote, fans of Bibi, unquote. And I can't disagree with that. With all this documented evidence of Israel reverse engineering US technology to build up its own tech firms with Israeli military intelligence people through the Talpiot program and Unit 8200, most alt-media personalities still never mention it. And Israel is the main reason now why China is a high-tech superpower. China got all of its military technology from Israel. And Israel has violated US law by re-exporting US military technology to China, yet they have never bared any consequences. In the 1990s, Israel supplied China with Python 3 missiles, which utilized US developed technology for Sidewinder missiles. And at the time, it rightfully outraged the lower levels of the US military, who have been slowly ramping up pressure against Israel and doing some damage. In 2013, a top Israeli defense official was forced to step down after the United States expressed fury at Israel's decision to sell military equipment to China. Also in 2013, the US military was reportedly concerned that the technology could ultimately find its way to Iran. Unbeknown to them, it was done 20 to 30 years ago. It's all out in the open now, and yet people still think that Iran is Israel's arch enemy. Now, in regard to the lower levels of the Pentagon being outraged at Israel for transferring US technology to our enemies, perhaps the Secretary of Defense James Mattis was onto something, as Brendan O'Connell pointed out. The Pentagon is now being audited for the very first time. And if this audit is legit, it could reveal the Pentagon's Israeli swamp, with all the shady companies with ties to Israel receiving billions of dollars worth of contracts from the NSA. Oops. And the writer of the article said the fact that Mattis and Trump are in a little rift supports this claim. However, it's very possible that this audit will be a ruse to give President Trump credibility, yet reveal nothing of value. I am open to both viewpoints. I'm not leaning to one or the other, and I'll always keep my eyes open on the matter. But the issue of the US subsidizing the Israeli tech industry is an issue that will get across to both progressives, who will be outraged that our government is subsidizing a foreign country's economy while sucking out billions of dollars from our own economy, and the paleo-conservative anti-communists who will be infuriated that our alleged greatest ally, which is fake, is funding and arming our enemies, Russia, China, and even Iran. This is the winning strategy, getting both sides of the political spectrum together on the same issues, not walking in the streets holding up a childish sign that says expel the Jew by 22, which Patrick Little did at a Holocaust museum. That sign that Patrick Little made is the perfect ammunition for the ADL and the Jewish-owned media to call all critics of Jewish power Nazis, who seek to throw out all Jews out of the country. That is not the way to go. They label anyone who criticizes them Nazis, whilst being the Nazi, National Zionist, N-A-Z-I. And the article writer says we need to reach out to the common Jewish taxpayer and explain to them that the Jewish elite are not operating in their best interests either. Ordinary Jews are just as much of dupes as the rest of us. They are being duped to support a supremacist state and ideology instead of learning to keep their culture within themselves and promote Logos, the natural order with the rest of the world. I couldn't have said it better, and I will leave it at that. And it's time for real Americans to grow a set and face this global enemy head on. I would sooner go down in a blaze of glory than act and be seen as a bunch of cowardly wimps.